I did meet a 6-year-old on vacation that was a lot braver than me when it came to a roller coaster. So, you know.
A fearless 6-year-old. I don't know that that's a level playing field, right? Being an adult, knowing what
it was definitely not fair.
Yeah.
All right, Chair Harrington, I will hand it off to you, and I will keep an eye out for Commissioner Willie. Commissioner Fye, are you with us? And here is Commissioner Willie joining right now.
We can see you, Commissioner Fye, and there's Commissioner Willie. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the afternoon portion of our Tuesday, July 18th, 2022, Washington County Board of Commissioners work session. This is Chair Catherine Harrington, and with me is Commissioner Nafisa Fye, Commissioner Pam Treese, Vice Chair Jerry Willie, and Commissioner Roy Rogers. We have a few really interesting topics on our work session agenda to be followed by an executive session. So the first one is the Encampment Management Program report, and I'd like to turn it over to Assistant County Administrator Marnie Kyle.
Well, thank you, Chair Harrington and Board. Marnie Kyle, as you said, I'm the Assistant County Administrator, and I'm really pleased to come to you today and provide another really great example of a lot of departments coming together to address an extremely complex issue, and that of houseless people that are living in encampments. So sort of at the most difficult stage of being homeless, where they're actually living out in encampments. So I want to thank John Cook for being on the call with us this afternoon, on the video meeting with us this afternoon. John, Mira Samantel, Josh Kreitz, and Courtney Duke Dreisen are all on our encampment leadership team. But the program involves folks from land use and transportation, from facilities, county council. Also Brad Anderson has been helpful. Tom gets pulled into it sometimes. So it really has taken a definite one Washington County team effort. So next slide, please. So today, it's almost a two-part presentation. So we're going to provide a very brief, Josh will provide a very brief reminder overview of the program. And then I'm going to provide, we were asked to provide some really most up-to-date cost evaluation. So the most up-to-date cost data. And then we're going to go into the 1-year evaluation, and Mira's going to talk a little bit about how the evaluation was done, and then I'll run through some specific assessments through several of the camps, and then we want to allow you some time for a policy discussion. So next slide, please. So the policy question that we have for you as you're listening to the evaluation today and the recent cost data, the question that we have is, should the encampment program be extended 1 year until August of 23 using tranche 1 allocated funds? And so just to be really clear, we are not requesting new funding or tranche 2 funds. This would be just an extension of the program using tranche 1 allocated funding. So next slide, please. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Josh just to give you a quick reminder about the program.
Well, good afternoon, Chair Harrington and Board. Josh Kreitz, Assistant Director from the Housing Department. As always, happy to be with you today. So as you recall, your board, as Marty just mentioned, approved this program back in June of last year. So the years have gone by really, really quickly. And you'll see there's a lot of information packed into what's happened in the last year. So some of the major program objectives have been, we really want to monitor and respond to human health hazards and violent crimes. We want to also prevent the spread of infectious disease in encampments, and also ensure that our folks who are experiencing homelessness are getting connected to the right systems of care, right? Behavioral health, substance use care, and also we're the housing department. We're a house, get all these folks connected to permanent housing options. Next slide, please. Just to dig in just a little bit further on some of the overall strategies of the program. Again, intensive outreach is a major part of this. We understand that it's important that we build up relationships with the folks who are out in these encampments. So we worked really closely board with the outreach providers who've been doing this work. We worked really closely with them. We built up partnerships with them. And I think even more interestingly, we have now taken over the management of the contracts for the outreach providers. So now Washington County, not only have we been able to take over those contracts, we've been able to provide a more steady funding source for those and expand. So we have geographic coverage across all of Washington County, and we can create more predictability, training, and all of the stuff that comes with that. So that's great. Centralized point of contact. We have some really great staff. When we first started this, Josh Legier was doing some really great work. We have Deanna now in the housing department, but I'll have to say, Emily Roots has done a great job. So we're giving consistent messaging to our constituents and those who are asking questions. They shouldn't be getting a different answer, about the same encampment. And I think we've done a really great job getting that consistency of voice. Sanitary and solid waste management. We pulled truckloads. You'll get information, so I won't preview it. We pulled truckloads of garbage and other unsanitary just items out of these encampments. So bringing down that health and safety risk. The health and safety assessment consistency is key here. So we can look at each encampment and take a look at it with a consistent metric and say, is this something that we want to support and keep in place? Is this something that we need to clean up? And then Marnie already mentioned it, the partnership with the Sheriff's Department. Everything, our department and housing's done with the Sheriff's Department has just been great. Just great partnerships. Always willing to pick up the phone and think through different options. So they've been great in this program. And we're just excited to continue to partner with the Sheriff's Office on this program. Next slide, please. And some of the key components here, that online reporting form. So there's an online reporting form where our community members can come. And if there's an encampment, they have a problem, a question, they can submit that information. And that allows us to go out. I just heard that our team was out looking at some new encampments today because of some of the information that came through the reporting form. Encampment assessment, as I mentioned, great to have that consistent tool that we can point back to. Services provision, solid waste removal, the portable toilet and hand washing stations, the outreach, which is a huge part of what we're doing, and then the encampment cleanups when a site's no longer safe, and then staff feedback. We work together really closely, look at barriers, and try to partner on all that stuff. I'm going to kick it over to you, Chair Harrington. I saw your hand go up.
I'm sorry to interrupt the flow of the presentation. I just needed the reminder. Is this a county-wide program or does this apply just to the unincorporated areas? Thank you.
Yeah, this is the program is in unincorporated Washington County, but we've had some partnerships with some of our jurisdictional partners. I think I'll have it. Next slide, please. So I'm going to pass it back to Marnie, who's going to walk us through some of the numbers here.
Great, thank you. And that was a great reminder, Chair Harrington. The program was designed to be within unincorporated and rural Washington County, but we did do a lot of outreach in the beginning with cities to see if they wanted to partner in a substantial way. And what we've learned is that it's more of a partnership as needed when they have a specific encampment that they need assistance with. And we've done that recently with Tigard and with Forest Grove. So thanks for that question. So this is where one of the things I was asked to do was to provide the most up-to-date financial data. And it gets a little bit, it can get a little bit confusing because in the next few slides, I'm going to be talking about overall financial data using the most up-to-date cost data we have. Later in the presentation, we're focusing more on the evaluation that was completed in May that looked at data only to February. So we'll try to be really clear about that. And because of invoicing, I try to provide the most up to date. So this slide shows overall costs. And so the most up to date data I could get to include everything was May of 22. So these are the costs from August of 21, because your board approved this program in late June. We really kind of started kicking things off in July, but there was about a month of ramp up. And so the data is really from August through May of 22. And you can see that the monthly costs are approximately $43,000 per month. And so if you project that out, we're projecting that the 12-month cost for this first year is approximately $513,000. So that is the most current. And it's interesting because we put it in this graph. And I just think it's interesting to see kind of the differences in costs through the months. So a lot of times what happened is we would go and do some big cleanups, and then things would kind of settle down for a while in some of these larger encampments. And then it would slowly over time might build back up. And so then we'd have another spike in costs. So you can see some of those differences. So it's kind of interesting to see. But if you average it out, it's just about $43,000 per month on average. So next slide. So this is costs that are broken out by site. And this data was pulled from invoices. And so it was current as of July 6th. And what's really interesting, and we're going to dig down a little bit more into each site, but you can see that 197th and Baseline, which might be the encampment that you've been hearing about for the longest. And it's one of the encampments that really kind of triggered this program, that got us thinking like we have to do something better to manage these instead of crisis. And then you can see the different encampments. So that is cost by the encampments. And the all other category refers to cost of smaller encampments and general supplies. So it might have been just a porta potty or a hand washing station. So that's what the all other refers to. So next slide, please. Okay, so this one shows total program cost by category of cost. And so again, this has the latest data that we were able to get was as of July 6th of 22. So you can see on this slide, total costs are depicted by the service category. And this one, other costs are associated with things like towing, storage, disposal of personal items and supplies. So you can just see, it's just a different way to look at the same data from the last screen that you can see by payroll, by the cleanup cost, and then sanitation and hygiene, other, and garbage waste. So next slide. So in this, now, okay, sorry. Now I'm going to turn it over to Mira Samantel. And so now we're shifting gears from current total costs to talk about the program evaluation. So Mira will kick us off on this section of the presentation.
Thank you, Marnie. Well, good afternoon, Chair Harrington, Board of County Commissioners. As Marnie said, I'm Mira Samantle. I'm the Interim Director for Health and Human Services. So on this slide, we're sharing information about the reports that were submitted between August of 2021, which is when we kicked off the online tool, to a point in time, which was March of 2022. I do want to take a moment and pause right here and acknowledge Eva Haas, who is a translational research analyst within HHS, and Renee Myers, who is a data analyst within housing, who did a fantastic job leading the program evaluation process, which provided us the information and data analysis that we're sharing with you today. So a big kudos and shout out to Eva and Renee for their help with the program evaluation. So when you look at this information, we're showing this online reporting tool, which, as Josh mentioned, is a single point of communication for community members to identify encampments and articulate concerns. So we really wanted to make it easy for community members to elevate these concerns. So again, as I mentioned, the go live date of the tool in August of 2021 through March of 2022, we have 122 online reports that were submitted through that online reporting tool. Out of those 122 reports, 119 were assigned a case number. So what does that mean? Why is there a difference? Well, 3 of the reports didn't include enough information for us to follow up on. So overall, we have 73 separate encampments that were identified using those case numbers, and we received an average of 1.67 reports per encampment received. And you'll see a snippet on this slide. That image there is an image of directly of what that online reporting tool looks like and what information community members would elevate if they were submitting it. Next slide, please. So on this slide, what we're looking at is really the areas of concern that were reported in that online tool. They were pretty evenly distributed with the exception of trash and garbage. You'll note that that one has the predominant theme. So respondents in the online tool are instructed to identify their top 2 areas of concern. They can do more, so they don't have to only do 2, but they're asked to identify their top 2. The average was more than 3 areas of concern identified per complainant. So I know the font might be a little small for some of the folks that are viewing online. So we're looking at crime concerns, drug and alcohol concerns, biohazard and hygiene needs, fire hazards, and then again, the predominant concern of trash and garbage. Okay, next slide, please. In addition to the ones that the top 2 concerns that folks are identifying, they're also able to enter additional concerns into an open field. So many respondents either reiterated their top concerns over trash and garbage in and near the encampment sites, but also concerns for the well-being of encampment residents, concerns about crime, and also concerns about children walking nearby or witnessing the behavior of encampment residents. So that's the information that were gathered on that online form. So now I'm going to turn it back to Marnie. She's going to go into more detail about the actual individual site assessments and their associated costs. Marnie?
Great, thank you, Mira. So now, as Mira said, we're going to just go through the 3 larger encampments and just give you an idea of what was happening with those larger encampments. So this shows you the main encampments that we did an assessment on. So you're able to see we did 40 assessments between July of 21 through the end of February 21. We had talked about collecting data and summarizing costs and assessment for every encampment, but the experience led us to understand that the majority of services had been concentrated on those 3 larger encampments whose assessment scores really fluctuated over time. So what we've done today is just summarize each of those main encampments and we'll present the scoring and costs associated with each one. And as I'm going to go through the costs pretty quickly because those costs were as of February. And we've already gone over the current costs by encampments, but just wanted you to see what was going on in February. So next slide. And these will match the full program evaluation report that we provided as part of this packet. So that's one of the reasons that I left this data in too, because this is really representative of the report that you received. So this is the assessment scores for 197th and Baseline during the pilot project. The encampment was cleaned last July at the program launch. It was our first one, which was followed by an assessment score of 0. And the low score was maintained over quite a bit of time. Finally, the encampment was given a second 2-week grace period for a score over 50 in December. And again, that was followed by a decrease in the assessment score. In February, we had to add 100 points automatically to the assessment score because we added a new category, which was flooding risk. And in the summertime, we also have a category for fire risk that's based on fire risk, including humidity and weather conditions and temperatures. So the other factors were considered with that. And so you can see that the red dots indicate when the encampment was cleaned up. So you can see several times when the encampment was cleaned up. So next slide. So this is those costs that are broken down for this specific encampment. So you've looked at these at the total cost for this encampment, but this is where it breaks out. Most of the cost, like many of the encampments, was in the cleanup of the encampment. And then here you're also seeing charges associated with personal property disposal from the Blanton Street storage, replacement tarps and supplies, those kind of things. Next slide. So now you're looking at the assessment scoring for Highway 97 and Porter, which you also are continuing to hear a lot about. The initial assessment criteria at this encampment was over 75. So that's when we initiate cleanup. After the encampment was cleaned, it maintained a score below 50 when we provided supportive services. But again, in November, we had to add automatically an additional 100 points because of flooding risk. And so you can see, again, different, ebbs and flows in the scoring. What we have noted about this encampment recently is that as winter shelters closed, this encampment has grown. And so like this encampment program and our housing services, I know that you're receiving a lot of constituent concerns about this encampment as well. So next slide. So again, these are the costs broken down. And again, you can see that the major cost is encampment cleanup on this encampment. So next slide. And so this is the last of the 3 largest encampments. This is 874 Southwest Baseline. And this encampment has not scored higher than 54 using our risk assessment criteria, but they failed to reduce their score after a grace period in August. And so we did provide cleanup services at this encampment. The next slide. And again, you can see the costs associated with the invoices related to this. In this one, you see 13,500 in a category we called other. And this was charges that included, again, personal property disposal. It included towing services, abatement, and storage of a burnt RV. So this is the encampment that you all probably are familiar with that we called the car wash encampment. Next slide. So this is, again, total charges. But I left this in because this was originally created in relation to the report that was done, the annual the evaluation that was done by Eva and Renee. But this cost data is outdated. And so those first 3 slides are really, if you want to see the most up-to-date cost data, you would want to use those slides. So next slide, same thing. And so next slide. So kind of to bring us full circle, and we do have Under Sheriff Cook here also to answer questions. But again, just to say what we learned through this evaluation is that the keys to success were really that intradepartmental and the external collaboration. So it was the communication across departments, because it often involved right-of-ways, and we had to work with LUT, facilities, often other cities, clean water services. So a lot of intra-departmental and external collaboration. The other thing that we learned through this evaluation is the importance of relationship with the residents of the encampments. The more that we were able to develop relationship with the actual campers through the Hope deputies, through the Hope deputy, and through the navigation and outreach staff at the different with our different outreach partners, the more cooperation and support that we got from the campers in trying to keep the area clean and self-manage. The other thing is just this encampment management team really working together to make sure we had communication plans in place, that we were, as Josh mentioned early on, that Emily was kept informed so that she could respond to constituents. Just everybody working together, working in the same direction, developing actual standard operating procedures, agreeing to those, sticking to those, but being flexible and learning from them over time. The 2 biggest examples are adding assessment criteria around flooding and fire risk. And then just making sure that we were able to collect some of this data so that we could share what was happening with the encampments, what it was costing, and what we were learning over time. So next slide. So this brings us back to the policy discussion. And really the staff's recommendation is that we would like you to consider extending the Encampment Management Program another year through August of 2023, using those tranche 1 carry forward funds. We're estimating the 1-year extension would be about $600,000. And that's my best estimate as of today. I'll go back and work with Will Culver, who has been fabulous and really helped provide a lot of this financial data for us. We are not requesting any new funds or tranche 2 funds. What this would really do is give us the ability to, 1, continue the work on adding shelter beds as well as permanent supportive housing. So really it would give us the time to have more places to send people. Also, it would give us time to bring to you a possible ordinance around time, place, and manner. So where can people camp and sleep, when, and what's going to be allowed and not. We're in the process of collecting from our city partners, other counties, and really looking nationally at what is the best practice. And that's where County Council is really helping to support us prepare for that. And then it also will provide more time for us to look for other funding resources, because we think even if we have the best homeless program in the nation, and we have all the resources that we can imagine, you are still going to have some people that for 100 different reasons are unwilling or unable to come out of the encampments. And we need to maintain some ability to manage those encampments, to keep them as small clean, healthy, and safe as possible. So it will give us time to do some more research and try to find some sustainable funding approaches to this. And so that's our other recommendation, is that you would direct us as staff to develop that plan to bring back to your board for consideration. And the last slide is really our opening for you to ask questions. We also have Courtney from County Council in the background ready to jump in and answer questions if needed. And Under Sheriff Cook is also on the panel with us today.
Commissioners, what questions or comments do you have for staff or amongst ourselves? Commissioner Fye, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Harrington. I think I raised my hand earlier, but then realized that it might be actually disrupting the process. But this is when, Mira, you were speaking about the survey, and I was just wondering, how do we incorporate the feedback and the voices of the actual people that utilize the camp? But then I realized that the last slide that Marnie presented with the 2 questions perhaps provide an opportunity to, especially the second bullet, to say, is there a way, since you're going to look into sustainability of the program, is there a way to infuse feedback from the encampment utilizers? Because I imagine their feedback is going to be a little bit different than what the housed folks say. So just throwing it out there. Just, I don't know if it's a question or a recommendation, but I saw an opportunity with your second question. So I would appreciate if you could consider reporting back.
Thank you, Commissioner Fye. That is something that, as we talked about evaluation, Renee and Eva were particularly interested in. And we struggled to come up during this 1-year pilot with a good way to collect that information. But I know that Josh and team did collect information from participants of the winter shelters, which is different because a lot of these people wouldn't use the winter shelters. So thank you for that question. And it's something we'll continue to bat around and try to figure out a good way to do that, especially now that we have stronger relationships with the outreach and navigation teams.
Go ahead, Commissioner Willie. Sir, you're on mute.
Yeah, I turned off my hand, but I didn't unmute. Where's the funding for this come from? Help me remember that.
So this is ARPA tranche 1 funding. Okay. Your board approved $1.6 million for the 1-year pilot, and we have underspent. We're right around $564,000, and so that's why we're requesting that we would carry forward some of those allocated funds for a second year.
Okay. Second question, and I just want to say, when you talked about collaboration and everybody working together, that's really great. I think that's extremely important, and I think we see it in how you're managing these camps, and certainly the work that you're doing to it. We see it as kind of an all hands on deck thing, and so congratulations on that, and for reaching out, and certainly all the partners that you deal with. My next question is basically on slide 16, where it shows the big spike because you had to add 100 points for flooding and fire. And I thought these scorecards were basically focused on how the people living in these encampments were kind of self-monitoring themselves with behavior, following the rules, those kinds of things. So I didn't understand why we would have to add 100 points to that assessment for fire and flooding. I thought that should be something else. So can you explain to me that philosophy on that?
Sure. And Josh or Mira, if you want to jump in at too, but I'll start. So since the beginning of the tool, we looked at health and environmental risk. And so what we realized as we started getting into the rainy months, and the spike that you're looking at was in November, is there was a big risk around both to the health of the individuals and to groundwater if we allowed people to continue to camp in these areas that would literally be underground. And so in what you see here is there's that large spike and then it goes immediately back down. And so with Tom's group and the outreach workers and the Hope Deputy, we basically just went and told people they absolutely could not camp in those particular areas. And there's other areas that are right away, like health and immediate life safety areas that we added large scores, and we just absolutely will not allow them to camp there because the risk is so high. And so that's why you see that big spike and then it goes back down, because they moved into other areas of the encampment out of the flood zone. And I don't know, Mira or Josh, am I missing anything? Or
No, I think that's spot on.
Yeah, you captured it well. It's really looking at the health and safety of both the campers and the local area and the environmental impacts.
Okay, well, yeah, that makes perfect sense. So that's a good answer. Thank you for that. And yeah, thanks for managing your money so we can extend this project into a year 2 and continue to manage those encampments. So I appreciate that. Good job.
Commissioner Rogers. You're on mute, sir.
There we go. I was going to try to lower my hand and I didn't do it. Okay. A couple of quick comments and then maybe some specific questions. One, just amusing that you show the field property. It doesn't look like that anymore. There's apartments on one end, as you know, housing project, and the rest of it's completely bladed off. So it looks very different than the picture. So you might want to use a different picture. My comment and my specific, one of the things that I've always said in regard to all of these funds that we've been receiving is that we really need to be partners with our cities more. It's something that I get from a political feedback, and I think this is a perfect example of where we could be. Everybody is concerned about these camps. They don't want them in their neighborhoods, but they understand there needs to be some due care. So having said that, Marnie, is there a way that you can tease out the dollars, because you're doing a location, which cities are benefiting, so that when we say we spent a lot of federal dollars, either under ARPA cares, whatever tranche we want to pick, we can say so much of it went to the cities, because the Fields property is a good example. That is squarely in the city of Tigard. I mean, that's we all know that. So there would be some city monies that we're spending on their behalf. That's one question. On the second, on your slides, even though I try to understand exactly what you're saying, and every accounting mind puts data in different ways, is there a way that you can aggregate, instead of having these various pools, that you can aggregate and show the total costs? And again, if we could do it by city location as well, I think it shows that we're collaborating and that we do spend money in their particular jurisdiction. That's pretty important. The last thing I'd say is, Marty, is there a way to bring some of our city partners into this conversation? Because I agree. My general comment is, I agree that you ought to have it a year more. I think you need to see what is going to be the ongoing plan, and what is our designations going to be for certain areas that you just can't camp there, safety or for whatever reason. So is there a way that you can engage, or maybe you have been and I just don't know it, because I tend to talk with mayors in my area and a few council presidents and that sort of thing, but not maybe not everyone that you're talking to at the staff level. Can you engage those folks as well, meaning the mayors, so that you can say, this isn't just a county problem, and maybe you're doing it, but they tend to say, well, as long as it's over there, or as long as you're handling it great, we don't have to worry about it. But people, they move around a bunch, and they got feet, and they got ways of moving, and so I think if we can say, this is all of our problems, and we're spending money on you to help you and to assist you, we would like you to assist us, and say, well, thank you. So does that sound self-serving? I don't mean it to be, but I think it's important that we collaborate.
Thank you, Commissioner Rogers. Those are great comments. So a couple things from the beginning, when this program was approved last June. The first thing that we did is kind of a road show, and we went to thank you to Chair Harrington. We spoke with the mayor's group. They really delegated to their city managers. We met with the city managers as a group. We, Sia, Josh, Mira, John, and I met individually with city managers, or like in Tigard, Chief Alpine. So we did go around to each city and had individual meetings. We went to their city councils. And most recently, we are having I don't know what you call it when it's every other month, meeting with city managers on all things houseless and homeless, to try to coordinate. And at the time, the cities did not want to participate in this program and did not want the county to do assessments or interventions on encampments within their city jurisdictions. And so they were very specific that they didn't want us. Now that is changing over time, because I think some of the cities felt like they didn't need our help, or they didn't have a problem at the time, or we had a specific program that used an assessment because we really wanted to apply consistency in how we managed. And at the time, remember, we started it during COVID. And so, over time, I think cities are becoming more engaged, more interested. We recently had an agreement with the city of Tigard, and we just helped them manage their encampment behind the library, which I think is probably what the picture that you saw, that was one of our most recent pictures. So that's why we use that one, because that was just done I think within 2 months, a month ago. And we're in the final stages. We have agreements with the city of Forest Grove. And so we're in the final stages of planning and communicating with the campers, and planning to assist them with a cleanup, and then to try to get folks to stay on a certain area. But we wanted to follow things, like we feel that it's important that we have very specific criteria that we're applying across the board, and that we're also making sure that we're incorporating outreach and navigation, and we're not surprising people with cleanups or the rules, so that we're working with those outreach providers to make sure the campers also know what the rules are, what we're doing, when we're doing it. So it's a great question, and we when we did agreements with the cities, we asked them to cover 25% of the cost because we have this ARPA funding and they understand that the county is really was covering 75% of the cost of supporting their particular needs. So that is work to be done. I agree with you. We need to continue to try to coordinate and collaborate with cities, and they really are hungry for it as well.
Can I just follow up? I'm sorry, Pam. I just want to make certain because it's important and I want to be able to parrot back exactly what I think I just heard. And thank you for the fields. That was the lower side. That fields goes all the way up, and as you know, there's a lot of development on it. So you informed them. That's good. You tried to engage them. That's good, because sometimes we think we engage by informing, and they're not engaged at all. They're just listening. You got back some pushback from some who were saying that they didn't have an issue or not wanting to be involved at this point, but now they are becoming more involved. And so what we need to do is for some of us who have those meetings really regularly, to ask them to, I guess, get even more engaged. If it's their problem as much. I mean, we don't see them in huge numbers camping out in Jerry's rural areas or my rural areas, with these around cities for service purposes. So we need to get them. Have I got most of that right? So I mean, I get pushed back, so I like to push back a little bit too and say this is a two-way street.
Okay.
Well,
and I would say that I think that the city managers are now committed, and they're showing up to a meeting every other week and talking about how do we manage this together. And as we're looking at our time, place, and manner ordinance, we're looking at, well, how can we do that together so that, because the homeless people don't necessarily know boundaries. So you make excellent points, and I would say that they're really engaged at this point. It just took a bit to get there. So now, mayors may or may not know, but I think as you all interact to really encourage them to connect with their city managers or with our staff, and we're happy to share. We've also offered to make the rounds to city councils again. So we're all open to that. Thank you.
Commissioner Treese, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for this presentation. It's really interesting. We've had a lot of talk about the costs, but is there a way that we can look at what the avoided costs are? I mean, I think that it's kind of, and I don't know that that there's a model for that, but certainly by doing the work that we're doing, by making the investments, we're avoiding. We've talked about health and safety issues. We've got those type of issues, but there are costs associated with the problems if we didn't do it in the first place as well. And so I'm just thinking about balance here. So when we look at the expenditure, and by the way, thank you for managing this so well that we can take this money out of tranche 1, which is great. But still, I'd like to get away from the costs, talking about how much this is costing us, to how much we are avoiding costs as well.
Thank you. I'm sure that Renee and Eva are doing backflips of joy hearing you say that. And that's definitely something we'll think about. How do we? It might be more of a literature review, but yeah, definitely that's something that we would love to be able to share. You're singing a public health tune.
Commissioners, are there any other questions? Okay, I have a couple. Could you help me understand to what degree, if any, you've had the pleasure of, through the case management and the navigators and the service providers, have there been any folks who have moved, have chosen, have chosen to move from camping outside to further along the continuum towards stable housing?
Yeah, that's that where we're headed, right? Like that's what we're getting excited about. I'll tell you, I just got an email from staff that a resident at the 197th in Baseline Encampment, so has been very long-term homeless. I mean, years and years and years, just signed a lease, and I think yesterday, and will be moving into their forever home here in the next couple of days. And those are the stories of success that we're looking for. So we're seeing that people who are going from our encampments into our shelter programs and then getting into housing programs. And we are starting to see that success. And I think as we continue to now expand in year 2 of our SHS programs, our outreach efforts and our case management efforts, we're going to see a lot more of these success stories take place. So we're really excited about that. And that's why we're all here. We want to get these folks inside and show our community that our interventions in both this program and our SHS program are getting unhoused folks housed.
And I know you folks are doing a lot, and you've been very patient with us in coming through different work sessions, different briefings to help us understand that you are seeing results. I was just a little concerned and needed the reminder. This presentation has outlined so well what the objectives have been, what the experience has been across different sites and in different viewpoints, so to speak, or assessment lenses. But I felt like I was being given the opportunity to really dig deep, as we had asked you to do, and you've delivered on, into costs without having that help me stay in balance with, in addition to meeting those objectives, right? To reduce the spread of the virus, to address health and safety. I've heard that loud and clear, but I needed that human success story or measurables for it. So thank you for bringing that to life for me. I also appreciated, let's see, I didn't know what the slide number was, but you did it, where you had a slide that listed like key successes identified with how the program worked, and then challenges or aspects that you continue to work on. Thank you. Thank you for highlighting that. I know you have done just a great job of putting processes in place in the middle of crises. Hello, right? COVID, wildfires, weather events, you name it, you've been dealing with it. But you've always taught me to remember individuals, humans, people, right? So thank you. I appreciate how you've put processes in place. You've worked them as a team, a cross-functional team. Thank you, Under Sheriff Cook, with your officers as well. We've each had the opportunity to be in different community members and to hear your deputies, whether they're Hope deputies or not, bring to life the experience, the human experience that people are facing and the challenges they're facing. So I look forward to joining my colleagues in supporting a second year of this program. And I know you will call on us to help foster any continued conversations with our elected peers. And I appreciate that as well. So I think as we go into that year 2, I will be looking for how we can assess and help appreciate the experience of the 2-year program in delivering services not only to the individuals served, but to their greater neighborhood areas, right? I really think different communities have really had the opportunity to understand that Washington County is regularly present and watching. And that I appreciated, Marnie, you're talking about how extending for a second year continues to provide time for us to build the shelter bed system and PSH, as well as work on other camping ordinances. So all really good stuff. I know it's a challenging space. I appreciate your practicing the art of the possible, even with funding. So go team, go. Let's keep trying to address these community needs that are faced here in Washington County and provide the opportunity for every community resident, no matter what type of residency they may have, to have the opportunity to thrive. Oh, darn it. So you have your staff recommendation. One thing I had meant to mention with regard to that year 2, because I know you'll have something, since we will have had more time on the SHS program, right? As well as more time with this program. Sorry, I don't have 2 arms going in the same way. I found myself trying to bring it to closure, right? That buying time. And I articulated it in terms of providing more of that human solution. Well, if I fast forward 2 years and think about how at the end of that second year, I may need a slide at the end of the presentation that reminds me of and where do we go from here, right? We will have had SHS in place for a good couple of years as well. So how do we show that integration and how one program maybe can ramp down a little bit or it be in stasis mode while another helps pull folks up into better opportunity.
Investments. So today's presentation is an update for you all on the county's current broadband work. Next slide, please. I'd like to be clear that today's presentation is informational. We will return at a later date with more information. We're not asking for direction today. We do not have specific policy questions. We'd love to take any questions you have, of course, and hear some of your reflections and thoughts in the presentation. But this is an informational update. Next slide, please. And Dorian, do you want to take it from here?
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, so a little bit of background and thinking about why we're having this conversation, why the board used ARPA dollars to make an investment in understanding broadband. Want to provide some background here, thinking about social determinants of health and the impact of broadband as being one of those. So social determinants of health are factors that deeply impact quality of life outcomes over the span of a person's lifetime. And even though they're referred to as social determinants of health, these factors not only refer to a person's physical health outcomes, but also the social and economic outcomes in their life. A few examples of social determinants of health include quality schools, the built environment like transportation, importantly, job opportunities, and many more. Taken all together, social determinants of health serve as a model across a variety of different disciplines and is really a standard framework that's used nationally across organizations, across federal agencies as well, to understand really what influences our communities and the outcomes for how people in Washington County live, learn, work, and play. For the last many years, increasingly, broadband is considered a super social determinant of health because its impact is so foundational to many other social determinants that influence a person's quality of life. And so when we think about internet access, fast and reliable internet really impacts people's access to health information, from accessing Washington County communications to their telehealth portals to online doctor's visits. It impacts a person's ability to get an education, whether that's accessing materials to completing assignments to what we learned in the pandemic for online learning. Internet is increasingly required just to search for and find a job, let alone submit applications or apply for things like unemployment benefits. And as well, we can think about things like accessing online marketplaces for commerce across a variety of disciplines. And increasingly, it impacts social connections. So we learned in the pandemic as well, connections to friends and family and spirituality, to more formal needs like online support spaces for mental health, addiction, and other services. So because broadband impacts all of these different factors that we consider social determinants, since before the pandemic and especially through, it's really being considered that super determinant. Next slide, please.
And also to build on Dorian's comments, and from an economic development standpoint, high quality broadband is an essential need for businesses and workers to fully participate in today's modern economy. For every business, whether you're a restaurant, office, farm, semiconductor, fabrication plant, all need fast and reliable internet connections to thrive. And it's been shown that high quality broadband connections promote innovation and new investment. For workers, broadband provides a variety of benefits. It enables hybrid work for those that are able to do that with their jobs, along with access to educational opportunities and training. So let me be clear, promoting universal access to high quality and affordable internet for businesses and workers is economic development. The pandemic made it clear that equitable access to government services, education, job opportunities, and healthcare require universal access to affordable and reliable internet. These facts were highlighted, as Dorian pointed out in the last slide, because of the inequities of our society that have really came to the fore during the worst of the pandemic. Some examples include kids without internet connections at home doing schoolwork in coffee shop parking lots, or unreliable internet connections disrupting hybrid work. So again, universal access to affordable and reliable internet is needed to ensure that all community members are prepared and can weather future disasters. Next slide, please. So with this slide, we'd like to orient you to where we are with the two broadband projects that the county is participating in. On the left side of your screen, you'll notice that the Columbia Pacific Economic Development District Broadband Study, an organization also known as COLPAC, has been working on a project that is wrapping up. Washington County invested about $25,000 in a cross-jurisdictional study alongside Clatsop, Columbia, and Tillamook counties to conduct this study. The study's goals include assessing the landscape of middle-mile broadband infrastructure, providing a path toward connecting anchor institutions, and planning and designing fiber infrastructure close enough to underserved households to incentivize private sector development of last-mile infrastructure. The project is in the process of identifying gaps in the middle-mile network throughout the COLPAC district, including areas of Western Washington County. The next step will be to consider developing operating agreements, such as IGAs or public-private partnerships agreements, to invest in and close these infrastructure gaps. The second project is the ARPA-funded countywide broadband investment strategy. Earlier this year, and using ARPA Tranche 1 funds, Washington County hired a consultant team to conduct a detailed analysis of broadband infrastructure, access, and affordability countywide, and to use that information and multi-jurisdictional conversations to develop a countywide broadband investment strategy. At the highest level, the purpose of this work is to help the county and government partners prepare for potential broadband investments, such as building broadband infrastructure throughout the county's geography and heightening household and business access to modern speeds at affordable price points with a focus on modern, resilient, and future-proof technologies. At the end of the timeline, all the way there on the right-hand side of the slide, you'll notice a note about anticipated release of state broadband funds. The state fund is a primary target for both studies and one of the primary drivers for these projects. Next slide, please.
Great. So I'm going to go a little bit more in depth on the comprehensive approach that we're taking for that ARPA investment. This investment is really being considered with 3 different frames: infrastructure, access, and affordability. This really goes beyond just lines in the ground kind of assessment to consider all of the different aspects that would impact a person's ability to get all of the social and economic benefits of broadband. So first, infrastructure, taking a hard look at present absence of connection, the connection types, really the infrastructure that exists, thinking about access, so degrees of at-home subscription uptakes, the technology that folks may or may not have access to be able to adequately use the internet, and also those areas of connection, speed, reliability, those sorts of things. And then finally, affordability. Are folks able to afford the cost of service per month, even if there are lines in the ground and plenty of service providers, for example? So there are a variety of different factors that we're considering in each of these different frames to really get a holistic sense of the status of broadband across the entire county. Next slide, please. So a little bit more detail here on that comprehensive approach. As Matt mentioned, really the purpose here is to prepare the county as well as the local governments that we're partnering with to make potential broadband investments. So getting all of the information that would be necessary for your board and others to make that type of decision. And also developing a countywide broadband investment strategy to support that. Really, the core components here include identifying the technical needs and building out a more complete broadband system, evaluating access and affordability, again, beyond just lines in the ground. What does it take to really reach toward universal access of broadband? And looking at those things by demographic and geographic variables. We're setting the table for cross-jurisdictional partnerships, not only because that helps us to better serve community, but because that is also a great boon to being able to go after the federal funding on the horizon that Matt mentioned. And preparing ourselves and others to potentially acquire funding to make really strategic investments. Next slide, please. And I'll let Matt go into some preliminary findings.
Thank you, Dorian. So we like to show a couple preliminary findings, and observations might be a better term to use at this point. So this is some of the work that we're doing with the Countywide Broadband Investment Strategy Project. This slide this graphic provided by one of our consultants, Uptown Services, shows the geography of the county, and the colors correspond with current broadband technologies that are in use. I realize there's a lot of colors here, but I'd like you to pay attention to 2 of the main colors, yellow and orange. Yellow represents areas that are covered by cable internet, also known as DOCSIS, and orange is fixed wireless. Green is areas that are covered with fiber. And I will note, again, this is preliminary. This is some of the data that is readily available. It's not up to date. And this is part of the project of drilling down deeper and getting more detailed street by street type data. So as you look at the map, you'll notice that the orange areas correspond generally with rural parts of the county and yellow to urbanized areas. Fixed wireless, the broadband technology that is most available in rural Washington County, is generally slower and less reliable than wired connections. Cable internet, the yellow areas, and then also fiber can provide modern broadband speeds and reliability. So this map illustrates some of the challenges and opportunities for future broadband-focused investment and potential policy interventions. In this way, it illustrates a tale of two realities here in Washington County. Rural areas are more likely to need new technology, new infrastructure connections to ensure that residents have modern, reliable connections. And urban areas appear to be generally covered by modern broadband technologies. However, this map does not show detailed street-by-street connections, and importantly, it says nothing about affordability of local internet connections. So clearly we have more work to do, and this is part of the study, is to get more detailed data so that we can come back and make more informed recommendations about the policy innovations your board and local jurisdictions may endeavor to choose. And with that, Dorian, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks. Building off of what Matt just mentioned about the infrastructure piece, there's only so much that infrastructure does if people can't access it and afford it. So going back to the concept of social determinants of health, it's really essential that we consider a variety of different variables across social determinants. For example, there are a variety of different social determinants that are directly related to racial variables. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and others consider things like social norms and attitude and the presence of discrimination itself to be a social determinant. Residential segregation is also its own social determinant. Across each of these different factors, leading with race really allows us to consider how community outcomes differ and helps us to identify potential solutions that aren't just one size fits all. In the context of this ARPA project, we're trying to understand infrastructure, access, and affordability while also taking a look at each of the identity variables to help us really understand what would be needed in service to the goal of universal access. So the chart that we have here is, again, very preliminary and just one piece of the puzzle for what internet access in the county looks like. Really, the key takeaway here is that not all racial groups in our community have equal access to internet at the household level. So for the census category of American Indian and Alaska Native on the far right-hand side of this chart, we see that almost half of Indigenous households in Washington County do not have internet service at home. While overall Washington County access for each of these categories tends to be higher than the state average, for this group, we're actually lower than the state average. Other highlights here that we can see is that 1/4 of Hispanic households in Washington County do not have internet access at home, and fully 1/5 of Black households do not have internet access at home. So because we know that internet access is a super social determinant of health, we can infer from these trends that this lack of internet access is also impacting social, economic, and other health outcomes disparately for each of these populations throughout the county. And this is preliminary. We'll be coming back with geographical representations of this type of data as well. But this was some of the first information we wanted to make you aware of. Oh, Jerry, would you like to go ahead and jump in with your question before we move on?
Yeah, and I'm sorry to interrupt your flow here, but to me, this graph would have more important data to it if it were number of households, because we know that we have a very low Black population in Washington County. So 20% of those would not be very many houses. Not that that would minimize that. It's just I would prefer to see the number of households that are impacted by what we're trying to accomplish here and how we would go about doing that. So again, I don't want to minimize any other of the races that have those kinds of numbers, but the number of households would be more important to me.
Sure, I'd be really happy to take that feedback back to our consultant team and make sure that we are presenting the population number and the percents. I don't think that that would be difficult to do. Any other questions or comments on this piece before we move on? Go ahead, Pam.
Thank you. I would also, if you change this slide, please just add the other one, because I think the percentages are important as well.
Can do. Thanks, Pam. Okay, can we move on to the next slide, please? Thank you. So some emerging
Commissioner
context.
Willie, don't forget to lower your hand, please.
Perfect. So some emerging context here. So Matt mentioned at the beginning of our time together that this is really just an informational update, a report check-in, so to speak. But we wanted to make you aware of some of the emerging context that is coming out of this investigation. The first of which being the potential county roles that we could have in broadband infrastructure, access, and affordability. And beyond what the county's role could be in broadband, what the county's approach could be to centering equity in broadband. And so we have some concepts to present to you today to get the wheels turning in your mind. We don't have policy questions for you to consider today, but given the depth and breadth of the considerations surrounding broadband, we wanted to give you this teaser today so that later on we're able to jump in to the context. Next slide, please. So for that first concept in thinking about potential county roles in broadband infrastructure, access, and affordability, the first strategic concept is really thinking about the county scope of service. I'm sure this is something that you consider in almost everything you do, and thinking about what our role is and the scope of what our service would be. And thinking about this in application to broadband, again, thinking about our role in infrastructure, access, and affordability, and as well, what the county's role would be in unincorporated areas. And Matt and I are beginning to look at geographical information that shows some of the differences, for example, in rural infrastructure or urban access. Some of the main considerations, not for today, but in the future, really thinking about what role the county has. So are we simply the convener and the collaborator setting the table? Will we be an active issue area leader and making investments? Are we going to see increased county ownership of broadband assets, for example? And then in addition, what role, if any, does the county have in addressing disparities in unincorporated versus incorporated broadband trends? Next slide, please. The second major concept we have here is the county's approach to centering equity in broadband. And really foundationally, what this means in terms of broader strategy is what your board sees as priorities for what community outcomes you want to see. Applied to broadband, we know that nationwide, there's quite a spectrum of view in terms of whether broadband is considered an essential utility versus being a luxury and everything in between. We see a diversity of delivery models, so the roles of publicly owned versus privately owned service providers. And finally, specific to Washington County, the application of your ARPA values, knowing that this is an ARPA-funded project. Some of the main considerations here: what are our values in addressing access to education, to healthcare, to workforce participation, to public safety? Again, all of the different determinants that intersect with broadband. As well, community access and affordability, thinking about what are those outcomes that you want to see across each of the foundational aspects of broadband. And finally, again, as a reminder, connecting those to your ARPA values in equity, resilience, collaboration, and good governance. Next slide, please. So the last thing we have for you today are next steps. Matt and I will be returning to you with project findings at a later date to inform board discussion on some of these emerging topics. We plan to maintain communication with you as this project develops. We're also continuously assessing emerging opportunities. And finally, we're continuing to build our knowledge on the landscape through survey and public data as well. So we gave you a teaser today, but we have a great deal more information to share as the project continues. And that's the extent of the update that we have for you today. And I know that Matt and I are happy to answer any questions that you have.
Commissioners, questions and comments? Go ahead, Commissioner Rogers.
How are you defining equity in this process? That's one question. If you want to answer that, then I'll ask my others.
I think they're using the county definition of equity. We don't have equity being defined on a department by department basis or a project by project basis. Rather, as you know, through our equity resolution, we have a definition of equity that the board has adopted. And if I have it wrong, I know that Ms. Angie and Mr. Carr are here, will gladly correct me.
Well, thank you for that. I'm not sure how it applies in this particular case, so that's okay. But my general comments are these: it's interesting that about 10 years ago we talked about this very thing, or 12 years ago, about some sort of a network, and what is a necessity in one period of time is not in another. With the advent of technology as it is, people can't frankly live without internet. That's just the way it works. And so I'm hoping that what will come out of this is something that's far-reaching across the county, not just in pockets or areas. And what we talked about way back then was that there's some sort of, as you see in Australia, I was in, well, it's been a number of years back. I can't remember if it was Sydney or Melbourne, where they had a citywide internet, I guess, free internet everywhere. And I think that as a public entity, as a public service, you're going to have to come to grips someday that this is much like you have phone service, or you have electricity, or you have garbage, or there's a whole assortment of things. We're going to have to deal with this comprehensively. So that's hence my equity question, because I think it's everybody everywhere in Washington County, and I think we're going to need to get there at some point. So anyway, I appreciate your presentation. Thanks.
Commissioner Rogers, specifically to slide 10, which shows racial breakdown with an access to Washington County, and the request from Commissioner Willie as well as Commissioner Treese for some different views of that. We will make sure that those views are included, as well as the county's definition of racial equity, so that can be kind of focused conversation when we come back to your board.
Commissioner Willie, go ahead.
Yeah, Roy, and just to follow up with that, I think that's probably why, remember, we started with the rural broadband study with Colpack, and then it was quickly identified that the rural area wasn't the only one that had deficiencies in our broadband service. And so that's why we initiated the, I'll say, the cities and the unincorporated areas versus the rural areas. And I think so when we talk about equity, that's, we're trying to talk about making sure that our county, both rural and unincorporated, and our cities all have access to this. And we are looking at it, the reason why I ask for household numbers versus just percentages, because again, that will help us, to me, identify making sure that we have equity across the board in all those respects. And so, so yeah, if we continue to go the direction we're going, which I'm pretty sure we are, Matt's done a great job of kind of keeping a foot in the Colpack arena, as well as our urban unincorporated area here in Washington County. And so we're going to move ahead with this. And I think we're going to be ahead of the pack across the state. And I'm really looking forward to, we're North Plains, we're North Plains and Banks are our two focal areas out of Colpack now, and working with the city of Hillsborough is how we can develop a ring. And I think we have great opportunities. So I'm really appreciative of the work that's been done, Matt, from you and Dorian's case, and certainly Rachel, thank you for overseeing all of this. I think we're going a great direction, and I just want to say, great report. I look forward to the next one and taking some strides in getting this accomplished.
Other commissioner thoughts or questions? Nothing from Commissioner Fye. Commissioner Treese, anything from you? No? Okay, your thumbs up. Great. I just have a couple of thoughts. First, I want to thank you very much, Rachel, Matt, and Dorian, for working with our city partners and others as well in this comprehensive examination of broadband infrastructure, services, access, affordability. Broadband and all of its associated forms throughout Washington County. We have various state legislators who have different levels of understanding and desire to dig into the details. You know, some really like to talk down to the, not the router level, but the network node for a, you know, community nodes. It's like, don't bother me with those details, right? Tell me on a whole, how do we make more, from my standpoint, how do we make sure there's more accessibility and more affordability? But I know that there's a lot to it, and nor do I intend to oversimplify. Could you speak for a moment, since there's been an articulation around urban, rural, and our larger cities? How are things going in terms of engagement and broadband access with our smaller rural cities, North Plains, Banks, and Gaston?
Sure. Thank you, Chair Harrington. I'm happy to jump in there. We have a project management team of folks from various cities, and folks from all cities in Washington County are invited to that. And we're actually going to be meeting next week, where we'll be discussing some of these preliminary findings and getting to more conversation about potential. I'm excited for that conversation because this project is an opportunity to ask each city what they need and what their goals are around broadband. And we've been in a number of conversations with North Plains and Banks specifically that are kind of on their broadband journey, trying to figure out, you know, North Plains in particular, which is a community that's growing. It's growing quite rapidly. And they're trying to plan for the future. They're trying to think about how they balance revenue and services, and how they can provide stellar services for their community. So I know that they're interested in thinking about new models there, and we're hopeful that this project is supportive of their efforts and efforts at all of the other cities. Dorian, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
I think that's great. I would just say that in addition to the more tactical project management team, we also continue to engage at city manager meetings where everyone is invited, and to stay in the loop at a little bit of a higher level. There's just a range of time, capacity, enthusiasm, all of the above, but we're taking multiple different strategies to make sure that the cities have an opportunity to connect and engage at a level that's appropriate for them.
Okay, I just have a couple of other things. Ooh, somehow I'm missing my slide numbers. So I appreciated your including the 2 slides before next steps titled Emerging Context, Potential County Roles in broadband infrastructure access and affordability, as well as approaches to centering equity in broadband. And as you move forward, so when we have another station, so to speak, on the journey of this important project, I would like to have a little bit of information illustration. I don't prefer to, let me put it this way first. I don't want to jump out of my skin in the next conversation saying, okay, well, if we want to provide service in urban unincorporated neighborhoods, right? The UUAs. It's like, whoa, wait a second. Before that, I would like to have a, to the extent that it can fit on one map, and it may not be a whole county map, but we have urban planning area agreements, UPAAs. And I need to see where, I know we have maps or the opportunity of getting maps that show where the city boundaries are, and then the hatch marks for where the UPAAs cover and illustrate which city, right, would be the, adjacent city to service neighborhoods. So, and also you talked about the street by street or neighborhood access. And so I'm interested in seeing us really make sure we have illustrative information about what the access, what the broadband access, I guess I'll use it as a word, or is it better, the best word, if for the adjacent neighborhood, right, in a city. So that's one aspect. Then the other is we're in this unknown journey here in our country, where the Supreme Court has weighed in on a case with regard to the EPA. And that wasn't just a ruling on the EPA and climate change and rules. It was a ruling that illustrated that the administration, which is chartered to implement policies, cannot be the group that defines the rules, right? It's that significant questions clause or role that is left to Congress. So over the last couple of weeks, there have been different opinions, not legal opinions, but different commentary that this may call into question the role of the FCC, the SEC, all of our banking rules. I mean, the FDC, it's like, holy smokes, things that our originalists can't argue that are the authors of the Constitution ever envisioned, that we may have a complex set of systems to make our everyday lives, which we can all take for granted, from one day to the next. So what that means is I think we have to assume a set of circumstances. I just want to make sure that if you end up writing a report, that you just spend a paragraph or so, just noting the time frame, the context, because over the course of time, uh, unbeknownst to us, right, the landscape of our nation is so large that irrespective of your doing this phenomenal work here at a county level, right, that all of this could just be thrown into total chaos and confusion. And that's not a reflection on your work. Okay, so I wanted to offer that as a technique for sort of parking lot to parking lot. Any questions that may come up or comments on that? Outside of our control, we'll just note it. We'll put it over there. We'll tie it with a ribbon. Poof, put it over there. Okay. So I look forward to learning more. Keep going. Awesome sauce. Great.
Great. Well, thank you, Chair Harrington, and thank you, commissioners, for this opportunity today.
Thank you. And thank you for giving us an informational update. I will freely admit I could use a shot of caffeine right now because that cookie I ate over lunch just isn't keeping me going. And we don't have a break for a little bit yet. So Dorian, you're going to take it away with the next topic. ARPA Phase 2 planning. Thank you.
Yes, you're stuck with me for just a little bit longer. Thanks so much, everyone.
No stuck with.
Thank you. As mentioned, my name is Dorian Russell. I coordinate everything for your board's use of American Rescue Plan Act funding. And today I just want to provide you with a planning update, really go through the process that your board has created and determined together. Can I go to the next slide, please? So today's purpose really is to review the planning process and reach board consensus together. So I want to emphasize that this is about improving the process and making sure that we're on the right pathway together. We'll talk about next steps toward making continued investment decisions, but today is not a discussion on our investment options. Again, today is about working toward consensus that this is the right process that you're happy with. Next slide, please. Perfect. So I want to acknowledge that speaking about process requires us to reflect on where we've been before. So your board has provided strategic leadership through one of the most pronounced emergencies in our history, with more than 1 million people in the US having died from COVID-19. And quantifying that scale of irreplaceable human loss, even while that's likely an underestimate, serves as a really painful reminder for why we're dedicated to continuing the vital work of recovery and in honoring the community members that we've lost. And so throughout this process, we've really been anchored with particular focus to those who have been disproportionately harmed by the negative health and economic impacts of COVID-19, especially those who were marginalized before the pandemic started. And so in Washington County, countless lives have continued to be spared through the tireless work of your board, our staff, and really importantly, the strength of our partnerships, including those with trusted community-based organizations and other local governments. And I'd like to acknowledge that the ARPA strategy has been informed and improved by the learnings over your previous CARES Act response too. And so this first phase of ARPA investment and implementation that we've gone through was able to be a careful balance of both response and recovery because of the previous work and because of that previous response period as well. And so as we move forward into additional phases of ARPA planning, we're going to continue to identify the lessons that we've learned, assess our effectiveness, and reflect on where we have been as an entire Washington County community. So in thinking about where we've been, I also wanted to take this moment to just acknowledge everything that brought us up to this point. Next slide, please. So where we've been, our ARPA values These are the values that are foundational concepts for your first investment allocations for ARPA funds. So we determined that in our ARPA programs that we're leading with equity, understanding that leading with racial equity, we're mitigating historical impacts, changing persistent systemic issues in service to achieving a more inclusive future. We're focusing on resilience, fostering strong organizations, individuals, and systems with that focus on long-term solutions. We're collaborators. We know that we achieve better outcomes when we work together, and this is shown in the strengths of the partnerships that we have across your portfolio. And finally, good governance, making sure that we are responsible stewards of the public trust and these resources. Next slide, please. So here's a bit of a summary reminder for where we've been. This is a summary of your investment areas to date using Tranche 1 funds. So this previous framework, it is included protecting public health, so things needed to survive COVID-19 and meeting basic needs. This first pillar includes the work that we're mandated to do in response to COVID-19. Secondly, community stabilization and wellness, so childcare support, behavioral health, family health, utility bill relief, and I think the timing is great. You also heard an update on that encampments program, which also falls into this category. Thirdly, you've invested in stabilizing and supporting the local economy, previously with business recovery centers, and now with workforce development, small business support, and also great timing, the broadband study that we just reviewed. And in addition, community engagement, investing in community capacity. We're doing this in a multi-jurisdictional coordinated way with cities who have received ARPA funds and are pooling that together. We're investing in data equity and diversifying our communications. We've also invested in continued operations and making sure that we are maintaining our service level without skipping a beat during the pandemic. And finally, the funds that we set aside for contingency, we're realizing that we really need to take an additional hard look at our continued operations and looking at ways that we can use that to make sure that we're staying consistent. Next slide, please. So really here, I want to take a moment and let you know that myself and dozens of other staff are preparing the annual report for ARPA. So in addition to what you heard today on broadband and on encampments, we're going to be reflecting and providing you with in-depth information on the status, the learnings, and the outcomes to date across the entirety of your ARPA investments overall to really see what we've accomplished in this time so far. Just a couple of tidbits here as a preview. Over the last ARPA quarter, so up until the end of June, we've had over 17,000 known COVID-19 cases in the county, just those that we know about. And at this stage, we've been able to distribute 36,000 at-home test kits, primarily with culturally specific organizations. You have also all seen the great news that we've awarded $2 million in workforce development, making sure that we're able to connect residents with quality jobs. And finally, building off of the previous success that we've had with your ARPA framework getting national recognition as one of 4 counties in the country to get a perfect score on the Results for America assessment, I'm also extremely happy to report that we've been selected to serve in a peer cohort within the Good Jobs and Equity Project. And so we're joining a cohort of other governments from the city of Philadelphia to King County, Washington, coast to coast, and many in between. So I'm really happy to report that we're excited to really use that information as we continue to advance your stabilizing the local economy investment area. Next slide, please. So taking a look at where we are now, I'd like to provide a timeline as some of the context here. So looking from 2021 to 2022, some of the places that we've been. May of last year, we received our Tranche 1 funds, and by September, your board had formally adopted the Tranche 1 framework, including those investment allocations that we just reviewed. The We Are Here star shows that this month we've received our Tranche 2 funds. Looking ahead, we have all the way until the end of 2024, almost 2025, to fully obligate all of our funding. So I want to call out here that while we have made investment allocations for Tranche 1, we still have quite some time to fully obligate the remainder of our funds. And finally, even though we have to obligate our funds by the end of 2024, we have another 2 years to fully spend it out. So thinking about the runway here, once again, we have until the end of 2024, so 2 years from now, to obligate everything, and an additional 2 years to spend it out. And we'll have to continue reporting on our ARPA outcomes to partway through 2027. Next slide, please. So overlaying a couple of layers here and really thinking about where we are and where we're going. We've used some terminologies like tranche, phase, a variety of different things. And I think as we're reflecting and taking a look at where we are at this time in the pandemic, we should revisit some terminology. So phase 1, your board made initial allocations for both response and recovery at the same time. We've been referring to response phase and recovery phase as if they're discrete, but really these things will continue to be overlapping. The second phase that you see here is where we are right now. So this reflection on our progress, we're assessing the programs that you've invested in. We're taking a look at all of your investments across that entire framework that you have created so far. And we're looking forward to more fully reporting that to you at the end of this summer. What we're working toward in this process today is thinking ahead to that phase 3 that you see in brown. So taking all of the information, understanding where we're at, working toward Tranche 2 funding allocations. We may find as we go through the pandemic, as we better understand public health needs, economic recovery needs, the whole holistic diversity of what pandemic recovery will entail, over time, your board may consider additional phases in the future, just as we continue to be nimble and flexible. We don't know what those are yet. So in summary, multiple phases. Phase doesn't necessarily mean tranche. We're really tying phases to our process here in service to recovery. Next slide, please. So where we're going, I'm really building off of this concept of learning to live amid COVID-19 and what that means during each of the phases that we have in the future. So first, we're trying to stay grounded, staying true to the intention of your board's values and also the federal intention of these dollars. So we're running our programs currently based on both community need and the known pandemic projections. So again, building off of what your board heard earlier this year from our public health experts. Secondly, we're balancing continued response and thoughtful recovery at the same time. We've gone through multiple phases, multiple waves, excuse me, of the virus. We've gone through so much in terms of the different tools that we have available. We've seen a diversity of workforce impacts. And so we're seeing a need here to continue to intertwine response and recovery really holistically. And finally, we're building resilience. Again, we've been nationally recognized for our thoughtful approach and how we're really trying to build more resilient systems grounded in equity through our use of these dollars. Next slide, please. So this slide is a summary of deliverables for your board to consider in the development of that phase 3 of your ARPA strategy of getting toward the point that you're able to make additional investment allocation decisions. I want to clarify that the items that are listed on this slide include things like assessments and proposed processes that staff will bring to you for board consideration at that time. So for example, what you see in that by September box is really us bringing versions of this thing for you to fully internalize and understand, not that we would be implementing it by September. And so each of these different things are to help you really understand the full landscape of where we are, to make sure that you feel comfortable and that you can most comprehensively make informed decisions toward allocating additional ARPA dollars. So in September, we will review the findings in that ARPA annual report. So the learnings and outcomes from what you've invested so far. We'll present to you our more comprehensive ARPA communications plan. And this really builds off of the ARPA annual report as the foundation, with also planning out additional tools and strategies. We're in the process of building a public-facing data dashboard on ARPA program outcomes, so programmatic variables and financial variables here, so that you will be able to click in at any time to see the status and the outcomes of different trends for each of the investments that you have. We're in the process of taking a deep dive into pandemic impacts to our operations countywide. So for each of our different departments, what continues to be impacting our ability to provide the level of service? And what does that potentially mean for that continuity of government operations investment area that you've already determined? In addition, we're developing a proposed process for external community organization funding requests if the board would like to go in the direction of providing the opportunity for community organizations to propose uses of ARPA funds. Staff are preparing to provide a more uniform way for folks to do that. So it isn't just based on an organization's existing knowledge of government structures. And finally, as you saw, we are eligible for revenue replacement with some of the updates to Treasury guidance. And so staff are in the process of developing policy options for the board to consider in terms of whether and how much revenue replacement out of ARPA that the board would like to consider. Looking ahead beyond that, we look forward to bringing back the outcomes from the multi-jurisdictional community engagement process to help keep you abreast of what community priorities are in recovery, as well as other engagement outcomes. So for example, thinking about different elected officials throughout the region, making sure that we have a plan to fully engage the electeds within our region and understand what their priorities and reflections are in thinking about a countywide approach to recovery. And finally, we'll be working toward those tranche 2 investment options. Onward through the future, again, understanding that we have a pretty long runway and we're only partially the way through, we're going to be continuously assessing the investments that you have, identifying what the learning and outcomes are, and making sure that you have a reoccurring review of what your investments are. Did we make the right decisions? Are the decisions that you made effective? What are the outcomes? Really making sure that we are tying the intention of the investment to the community impact of the investment. Next slide, please. So this table includes a summary of what has been spent or contracted and what remains for each of your ARPA investment areas to date. And a far more comprehensive table with spending across the dozens of programs was included in the board packet. We're in the process of making sure that that formatting is really clear and available on the public website. And it was also sent out to you this morning. The key takeaway here is that in balancing the challenge of both response and recovery at the same time, we've been both effective and efficient. So over a year ago, I was in front of your board with very deep uncertainty in how much continued response in protecting the public health area would cost. And the allocation for this investment was a 1-year projection made with really great caution. The good news is that your first investment has carry forward available for continued response needs, much of which is mandated work in responding to COVID-19. Across other investment areas of work, program design and implementation has undergone really intentional processes and co-developing strategies with community partners. And the progress in these areas continue to focus on meeting goals that are outlined with community. While this takes more time than historical efforts, it also allows our strategy to have greater impacts on population that are disproportionately impacted by the pandemic in aims of equity and universal recovery. And staff are currently in the process, again, of conducting that comprehensive review of government operations to ensure that we're sustaining a baseline level of service. Overall, Washington County has done a really exceptional job in ensuring we have nimble and flexible operations. And at this stage, we're identifying that we'll need to apply contingency funds to this investment area and look forward to providing you a more comprehensive overview on that in September. So overall, in summary, we have 2.5 more years to fully obligate our funding and 4.5 more left to fully spend it out. And thus far, your board, for the board adopted investment areas, just for this first phase, approximately half of tranche 1 has been expended or obligated, and half of it is remaining. Next slide, please. So I just presented some pretty good news regarding your public health investment and the carry forward that we have available. But in this slide, I have some news that complicates that picture a little bit. Washington County continues to fund our COVID-19 response mandates with ARPA dollars. So we're currently wrapping up a really detailed assessment of what our COVID-19 mandate compliance outlook looks like, and we'll be providing that to you in detail in September. But I wanted to provide some really important context to you today to get your wheels turning to really think ahead for a board discussion in the future on the topic of mandates and ARPA spending. So the graphic that you see on this slide illustrates a spectrum in 2 ways, a spectrum both in terms of compliance and a spectrum also in terms of level of service. And so the current projection that you see here, after applying carry forward to your current investment, we would need $9.9 million just to meet our bare bones compliance level. As you move to the right side of the spectrum, you can see a higher level of compliance with mandates. And the reason we have a spectrum of compliance here is due to flexibility in how we interpret some requirements. For example, we're required to ensure access to vaccines. While Washington County may be able to get away with a lower service level and not necessarily have the state come after us, we've taken access to vaccines to mean equitable access, and this is shown in the recognized successes that we have in working to close gaps in vaccination rates across racial groups. Further to the right on the spectrum is a more comprehensive interpretation with ambiguous mandates and would mean a higher level of service than we have right now. To maintain our current level of service, it would mean investing at least $34.8 million in addition to the current carry forward for these areas of work that are mandated. So not any other area of your ARPA investment portfolio, just for the surviving COVID-19 area and that mandated work. So to be really clear, myself, staff, we're not looking for an answer on this topic from you today, but given the scope and the importance of this topic, I wanted to provide this preliminary information ahead of our next conversation together and a deeper dive on this topic. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. This graphic should look relatively familiar. This is the phase 2 planning process that we're going through together now. So we've been at the pandemic epidemiology projection. So public health professionals came and spoke to you earlier this year about the different directions that the pandemic could go and what that means for our response work. Commissioners Harrington and Willie have been serving on the steering committee, developing the planning process and creating this for your review. Each commissioner has had the opportunity to weigh in on this process. And now here we are today that we are here, arrow in the middle. We're really looking for really comprehensive feedback board-wide, trying to get toward consensus in our planning process. And looking ahead, we're going to have additional work sessions going through those deliverables that we talked about, making sure that you have the full breadth of information before you make additional ARPA investments. Next slide, please. And so what myself and others are looking for today in understanding your perception of this process is what's missing for you. Are there any steps or additional items or deliverables that you would like to see? Or is there anything else that staff should take into consideration as we move with you in this process? And that's looking for your feedback there. That's all I have.
Could I ask for a clarifying question for the benefit of all of us? I'm trying to take the slide, next steps, ARPA planning deliverables that talks about September, November, and onward, and overlay that onto the phase 2 planning process. And if I have it right, I am assuming there's a September big blue box and a September 13th work session. And then there's November and onward. Does onward go with the last 2 BCC regular meeting and BCC work session?
I'm happy to answer that. So we may possibly need, I believe we have scheduled one in September and one in November so far. We'll see how many work sessions that it truly takes to get through those first 2 blue boxes that you see here. Targeting at this moment to have some additional investment allocations decisions late fall into the winter. Okay. For that brown box that says onward, that continuous assessment and reoccurring commissioner review, we see that as happening throughout the ARPA investment period. Yeah. So understanding that every year we're having these comprehensive reports on our outcomes. We anticipate that your board wants to stay in the loop on what community outcomes are, and potentially, if appropriate, and depending on what community needs are and where we are in recovery, potentially reconsider that as we go on. With continuing to stay nimble and flexible, continuously learning, continuously reflecting with you, because we want to make sure that we got it right. And we have a long runway to make sure that we're doing that.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you for that clarification. Commissioners, what are remember the staff wanted to make sure that they laid out a recommended planning process, and they're asking of us if we have any questions about it, if you think there are any steps or deliverables or pieces missing to this planning process, and anything else you would like to see them take into consideration. So I'll open up the floor. Any questions or comments? Commissioner Treese is all good.
I'm
Go ahead,
happy,
Commissioner Rogers, and then
happy.
Commissioner Willie.
sure, happy to jump in. One of the things that I thought was a really good plan early on was, and I think I'm going to give credit to Jerry and Pam, because I think it was their idea, business recovery centers. And frankly, small businesses got a lot of loans that now have been forgiven, but there's not going to be a number of them standing unless we continue to take a look and say, well, what kinds of resources do they need to continue the economy? Whether there's money there or whether there's discussion there, it seems like there ought to be some amount of discussion about those sorts of things, meaning small business assistance, because if you have a economy that's faltering, and we all hear news about the recession, we all know that this can't last forever. I think we got some problems. So hopefully somebody will have some discussion, tell me why that's not considered. So that's one issue. The second one is you keep flashing that slide that says revenue replacement options assessment. I don't know what that means. That's code for, I think, taxes. And so I'd like to understand more fully what that means, so that we're very transparent to a lot of folks who may be looking at tax increases, so that they understand what we're doing. So what does that mean? And maybe I'm misinterpreting that.
Sure. So underneath what we're allowed to spend ARPA dollars on, the U.S. Treasury provides a calculation tool to take a look at what local government revenues were before the pandemic, look at what they would have been projected at during the years of the pandemic, and allows us to calculate how much less revenue that we had through the pandemic years. And so we're able to take ARPA dollars and, in essence, give that back to ourselves to replace the revenue that we would have had were it not for the pandemic, if that makes sense. So how much less revenue the county had in 2020, 2021, and onward, we're able to essentially take that and pay ourselves in that way, if that makes sense. And there's a much more eloquent way to say that.
Commissioner Rogers, let me answer it directly. So per the calculation, we have had at this point in time 13 million in revenue loss. The state, as well as other local jurisdictions within our region, have used some of the revenue loss ARPA dollars to help stabilize their budgets during COVID response and recovery. So that can be a strategy that your board, should your board decide, as we look at all the ARPA investments.
So I think I understand that, Tanya. That doesn't mean some sort of a taxing plan on the general public.
No.
Well, I wanted to hear. All right. Thank you.
Go ahead, Commissioner Willie.
Thank you, Dorian, for this, and for certainly modifying, or I guess making your adjustments to that that schedule that I was using to compare, before and after. I still have the question of, we spent about 50% of our tranche 1 dollars. Are we going to stay the course with how we anticipated allocating that money and spending that money? Are we going to stay at that, or are we going to hit the pause button and step back and say some of it probably has lost that high of a priority? We can reallocate it into something else. What's our plan for that? And if you told me that in this presentation, I'm sorry I couldn't see it in here, but yeah, could you give me a little bit more information on that?
Thanks for that question. I do think it could have been more explicitly spelled out in the presentation. That's really a decision for your board. And I think it also goes back to Catherine's first question too about, that brown box that's onward, like how are we assessing whether or not what you're investing in is having the desired impact. Through this process in the fall, the question of whether the allocations that you've made are the right ones and whether you want to consider reallocation is a topic that your full board can consider this fall. And then we also anticipate that being built into our continuous review process as we go on over time.
Okay. Well, yeah, and as we've had, you met with the chair and I a few weeks ago. I appreciate all of this information, and yeah, we'll just continue to go ahead. The good news is we have this money, and so it's our responsibility to make sure we spend it where we need to be spending it. And as Tanya said, certainly looking at revenue replacement and what would that look like, realizing that it's a one-time Band-Aid, and at some point in time we'll have to rip that Band-Aid off. May be a little painful if we don't do that correctly. Thank you.
Commissioner Fye, any questions or are you all good?
I don't have any questions per se, but perhaps a comment. Dorian and the team, great job on this presentation and two heavy topics back to back. I'm wondering, my comment is about Commissioner Willie's comments about the Band-Aid and ripping it off. I'm wondering, how do we demonstrate that level of impact for culturally specific organizations that do receive some of these? That's been really helpful to them. If we do take that away, what does that mean? And what kind of a negative impact or unintended consequences are we going to see from our community impact? And then one other thing, I forget the slide number, but there was a embarking on the September, I think it was the September blue box, the community organizations proposal process. I'm wondering, how do we quantify the impact we've had thus far on our community? Yes, that one. External community organization funding request proposal process. I mentioned that, not necessarily at that point, it's specifically, but how do we quantify both the positive impact that we've had on our community to tell the story of the negative impact it will cause if this money goes away from the community? So I'm wondering, how do we tell our story from a quantifiable perspective level of our impact, the impact this money had for our community? I had another thought, but I think I lost it. But yeah, kudos. Whatever information that you can provide when you come back will be helpful.
That's really helpful feedback, and I'm hoping the next deliverables that we bring to you help to answer some of those questions, because these are certainly things that staff are chewing on really deeply. So thank you.
Yeah, if I can jump in, Commissioner Fye, I am hopeful that the report that the team is working on will have some of that information. This is incredibly important information. As I've informed your board, I remain very concerned about the unfunded state mandate for COVID response. And that's not just, as you mentioned, that's not just county staff working. It's in partnership with many of our CBOs in an integrated collective fashion. And so that does, what our deliverables and outcomes have been is a really important conversation going into this upcoming legislative session.
I really benefited from hearing your questions and comments and interaction there on that September line item and our current CBO engagement. And I think this is where we may need to potentially change some phraseology. The team is working with a lot of community-based organizations as part of our response and recovery, right, to the pandemic. And what we've asked for with potential tranche two, for a potential tranche two framework, is the opportunity beyond that pool of CBOs. How might we have another process for entertaining ideas and applications from other community organizations for other programs or projects that would further the community economy and other needs that we're not already doing with our CBO engagement? And I don't have any suggestions as I sit here on how to differentiate those. At the same time that I was thinking earlier as part of this and hearing myself articulate what I just said, I'm also reminded that at least during the CARES Act, I recall the funding there, working with WSI on that rapid redeployment of workers. And Work Systems, Inc. was also the recipient of funding, not from Washington County, that they offered to CBOs to try and support CBOs pivoting, right, from in-person operations to exclusively remote operations. And outside of our own consciousness, right, and this program, I don't know if there is a program to say, hey, nonprofits in general, how are you doing after almost 3 years of COVID? And it's sure, hearing Commissioner Rogers, we could think of them as small businesses. And maybe we do need to expand our thinking there in order to understand not just for small businesses, but also nonprofits who have either had to go on pause or are on life support. How do we help them how does someone help them get reinvigorated? And if not us, then who? Given that they are nonprofits here in our community. So those are a couple of things I got out of that whole conversation, right? Ideas to further think about. So this is where I really appreciate having group conversation on these presentations. Commissioner Willie, I appreciated Commissioner Willie pointing out that he and I have seen a version of this presentation previously, as he and I serve on as liaisons for the steering committee to help bring this information forward to you. And I just wanted to share, when I looked at the slides, I appreciated seeing the where we are, ARPA key dates timeline, and then where we are, ARPA phases timeline. And when you went on to the next slide, I brought myself back to the timeline slide because I was like, wow, ARPA passed at the beginning of 2021. We have to spend it all by the end of 2027. That's 6 years. Here we are looking towards the end of 2022. So that'll be the end of the 3rd year of this pandemic. And we're not there yet as an endemic, right? So in my non-health, non-scientist brain, we had the virus, we've had initial vaccines. Yay. We've had boosters, still dealing with that main virus. And now with we're in this BA5 or whatever it is stage. And now they're talking about having a variant booster, right? Like an Omicron variant booster, maybe in the fall. And the reason that I articulate those 3 stages and getting to a variant booster is, in my layperson mind, I'm thinking, you know, until we go through a couple of rounds of what I'm calling variant boosters, I'm not going to feel like I'm living with COVID, kind of like the flu, until we have a couple more of those stages. And clearly in my little brain, we're not anywhere near that yet in 2022. So 2022 in my brain is counted for. So all through 2023, we're still in a new phase. And why this is important for me to realize comes to your slide on COVID-19 mandates, compliance, and the service levels. Because Team Washington County, and that means not only Washington County staff, but all of our partners, you've done a tremendous job in saving lives, reducing suffering, and helping address some of the economic difficulties. Saving lives and reducing suffering, I'm thinking about individuals and families. People. Addressing some economic difficulties, people, families, and businesses. So as I sit here thinking about the future years to come for COVID mandates, in my head and heart right now, I'm thinking at a minimum, I want to aim for current service levels. And I know you're not asking me today, okay? I know that. But there's an ask here for the future months. You're doing some work to address some economic difficulties with individuals and families. Sorry, I have to pull out my super colorful sheet. We do have, we don't, yes, we do. Yes. We will, I do want us to have a conversation about stabilize and support local economy moving forward as part of tranche 2. But I'm thinking now that we're going to have to talk about 2 service levels there, addressing some economic difficulties and recovery, as well as another level of further reducing those economic difficulty. So expanding that level of support and seeing, because we may not have enough headroom to get as far as we want. So we may have to have some levels of understanding. That's all that we sort through, because we only have an additional 58 million that, thank goodness, with your timelines, I'm now faced with the reality that we have a minimum of 4 more years, right? Previously, I hadn't thought about how ARPA was a 6-year funding program, right? I was thinking 4 years. It's like, no, Catherine, do the math. It's a 6-year spending program. So I get it now. Thank you very much. And congratulations on the recognition for Good Jobs and Equity Project. That's great. I look forward to hopefully seeing a Washington County media release, because you folks have yet again knocked it out of the park. Thank you for reaching for the stars, right? To help people, help our businesses, and at the same time, in your doing that good work, you've earned some recognition outside of ourselves. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Oh, one last note. If I look at my handy dandy list, out of all this today, Dorian, what I realize is that moving forward, I have to make sure to share with my elected peers that September through the end of November is a really good time for them to be paying attention, that we're going to have some events for them, like some meetings for them to come and hear some ideas we're pondering, right? And some other meetings. So in addition to whatever they're going to have on their plates for their standard work, we're going to want their input in, we're going to need to help them get on our journey in September and get some ideas and proposals under their noses in October and November, is what it sounds like to me. Cool. Great. I think I got it. It's only taken a couple of presentations, but I think I got it. Anything else, commissioners? I haven't been watching time, so I hope I wasn't too slow.
I want to make 2 remarks. One is that your comment regarding nonprofits being like a business is absolutely correct. Government's like a business, and so sustainability is important. So I'm glad you caught my point. I think that's really well said. And to Jerry's point, he's absolutely correct. I mean, there's going to be some course direction. We're all needing to be eyes wide open. I've been saying that for a bit, and I think he's just pointing the obvious. And so whatever we do, I hope that we don't run at the cliff at 100 miles an hour, that we start applying some brakes and figure out how do we stop at the right time. So I agree with his comment.
So you asked for input, we gave you a bunch, and you clarified a bunch of questions too. So thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Onward, ho we go. Okay, folks, we're a little late for a break, but it's break time nonetheless. We've got 15 minutes. So we'll see you back here at 3:45. Okay? No? I have my math wrong?
No, are we, do we go into an executive session?
Yes, but
So
it'll
we're
be
not
at
gonna be-
3:45.
Right, but not on, it's a new channel, so to speak.
You are correct. Thank
Okay.
you for catching that for me. I appreciate that.
Yeah, so commissioners, you can just make the motion here and then we'll take the break.
Yep. Thank you, Clerk Moss. So Commissioner Treese is making the motion for us to adjourn to executive session pursuant to ORS 192.660 sub 2 sub D for labor negotiations. Do we have a second? We have a second from Commissioner Fye. All those in favor, please vote by raising your hand. Thank you, commissioners. Any opposed? The motion carries unanimously 5-0. So we'll see you all back at 3:45 on the other Zoom link. Thank you. Bye.